questions and answers at the end. So for those of you I haven't had the chance to meet, I'm Martha Dragich, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here. I'm happy to see all of you here today for our presentation on implicit bias. I want to say at the outset that this presentation is part of our One Read program and is co-sponsored by the American Constitution Society, the Black Law Students Association, and the Women's Law Association, and we're happy to have their participation as well. So this year is our first year of a One Read program, and we chose the book, as you know, Just Mercy by Bryan Stevenson. That book looks at a lot of issues having to do with racial discrimination and bias in various contexts, and lots of other issues as well. We wanted to use that book as a springboard to even look at broader issues. So not that that context isn't important, it's very important and very relevant, but we can look at other things as well. And I think in the book, we see more examples of explicit and systemic bias. What we're going to talk about today is another aspect of the situation, and that is implicit bias. So the question is, why do these things keep happening? Things like the racial incidents on campus and in the world we hear every day. Why do these things keep happening? So we're fortunate to have as our guest today Dr. Laura Scherer from the Department of Psychological Sciences, whose research is on the topic of implicit bias. So she's going to be talking with us about how this phenomenon works. What is it about how we think, how we react, how we make decisions, how we form judgments that contributes to some of the difficulties we have in understanding each other and developing empathy with each other and so on and so forth. So that is our topic. Just a couple of things about how this is going to work. We're trying something new today. It turns out that our colleagues in the law school at the University of Oregon have identified the topic of implicit bias as a focus of their study this year. And so it's a one-way stream, but we are streaming this presentation to them. And we hope that perhaps later on in the year, some of the presentations that they are having at Oregon will be able to be live streamed here for our benefit as well. So that's going on. And so the one thing that you all need to know about that is that at the end, when it comes time to ask questions, please come to this microphone over here so that your questions can be part of the live stream so that folks at Oregon can hear. And they will be able to ask questions if they wish from Oregon by sending an email to Cindy Bassett, who will ask questions on their behalf. Okay. Just a word or two about Dr. Scherer, and then I'll turn things over to her. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychological Sciences, as I already mentioned. She has her PhD from Washington University in St. Louis and did a postdoctoral work at the University of Michigan. So she comes to us very, very well qualified. The lab that she works in on campus is called the Attitude and Decision Making Lab. I don't know too much about what that is or what it does, but it sounds absolutely relevant to what we're doing here today. So without further ado, I will turn things over to Dr. Scherer. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. So when Martha and I talked about potentially doing this session a couple of months ago, she said, wouldn't it be great if I could share some of my knowledge about implicit bias, and in particular implicit race bias in light of a lot of the things that have been happening in our society lately. So what I've decided to do is basically give you an introductory tutorial about implicit race bias in particular, but also I'll touch on other kinds of bias along the way. It's very hard for me every time I talk to a new kind of audience about this topic, because we have so much research showing that people have implicit associations with different groups and that this can influence their behavior. There's just so much data I could draw on. I could speak to you for 24 hours and not even get to the bottom of all of this. So what I've decided to do is this. I'm going to start at the very beginning, and I'm going to tell you how we psychologists think about how we categorize things in our environment. That's not going to seem very relevant at first, but I'll show you how it is. Then I'm going to jump to how we categorize other people, and then how we draw inferences about people on the basis of the way that we categorize them, and that we do this instantaneously and completely effortlessly. So after I get done giving you this groundwork, so just laying this groundwork, then I'm going to propose and try to answer with data 3 common questions that people have and that social psychologists have tried to explore. So question number 1 is stereotyping automatic? Automatic meaning, does it happen just spontaneously and really fast, and does it happen outside of my control? And if so, how do we know that? So what are some of the methods that have been used to show that? Question number 2 is, do stereotypes have to be endorsed in order for them to influence our judgment? So a lot of people think that, yeah, I have to agree that the stereotype is true in order for it to influence me. Social psychologists, or the data that we collect, seems to suggest otherwise. Question number 3 is, do these processes influence behavior and actions, or do they just influence what I think? So maybe you can show me that what I think can be changed by these stereotypes, but does this play out in any kind of meaningful behaviors at all? And then question number 4 is, do we have any evidence that anything that I'm telling you applies to anything in real life? And I'm going to show you one study that suggests that it may. Then I'll go through some summaries, some conclusions, try to wrap it up for you, and answer some questions at the end, and I really hope to have lots of time for questions at the end. Okay. So first, I'm going to really start at a very basic level, and I hope that you don't think I'm trying to insult your intelligence by asking you what this is. It's a chair. Excellent. Good. You have never seen this particular chair before, unless you search the internet for pictures of chairs like I did. But you know exactly what it is. You know it instantaneously, right? This is a process, and it's called categorization. You're really good at this. You know that this is a chair. You know it instantaneously. And because you know it's a chair and you've categorized it in this way, you have now formed all kinds of expectations for the quality of this object. So, for example, you know that it's for sitting. As a result, you know that it can probably support your weight. If you were to sit in it, it wouldn't squish down. It probably wouldn't burn you. It's not fixed to the floor, probably. You can probably move it around. And you are very likely to find an object like this in a living room, right, as opposed to on somebody's roof or, in a cave underground. Okay? So you formed all sorts of expectations for this object, even though you've never experienced it before, you've never seen it, and it's just a picture. Categorization is a really good thing. This is a fundamental cognitive process that we all do. The reason why it's good is because imagine how our lives would be different if we couldn't categorize things like this. Imagine you live in a place where tigers exist and they're out in the wild. If every single time you encountered a brand new individual tiger, you had to relearn all of its characteristics and behaviors, you would not last very long. In fact, you probably wouldn't get past your second tiger before you were eaten. Okay? Categorization is a survival skill. And what it does is it allows us to make assumptions and draw inferences about things that we've never directly experienced before. I want to just give you another example that will show you how good you are at doing this. So what's that? The second picture. It's a tiger, right? Just like the other one, right? But you were able to make that inference even though you can't see its body at all. All you can see is its head. So you can tell that that thing is a tiger only by this very little piece of information. And note what you've also done. Even though its entire body is obscured, you're going to make some pretty strong inferences about what the rest of that tiger looks like underneath the water. If it were to jump out of that water and it had wings and hooves, that would be extremely surprising. And that's because you've made all kinds of assumptions about what this thing is. That obviously is a lion, right? Very similar animal. Imagine that you had never heard of a lion, you've never encountered a lion, you've never seen a picture of a lion. If you knew about tigers, you would be able to tell me a lot about that animal too. And that's because they're very perceptually similar, right? You don't even have to know what a lion is, but if you know something about tigers and you know that that lion looks a lot like a tiger, you're going to make all kinds of inferences about its behavior. You're not going to know that it has sharp claws, sharp teeth, and that it might eat you. Okay. The process of categorization that we all engage in is extremely fast. It's totally uncontrolled. We don't have to try to do it. It's unintentional, and it's totally effortless. If you had to try to categorize each chair you ever came up to or each tiger, you would not be able to respond to stimuli fast enough. You just wouldn't work very well as a person who's interacting with your environment. And again, the major advantage of categorization is that it allows us to form expectations about the things that we've never experienced before in our lives, so about novel things. So, you know what? I'm actually missing some slides. That's very odd. Okay, well, I'm missing a slide, but I'll talk through it anyways. What does any of this have to do with people? The reason why this is relevant for people is that we have this basic cognitive architecture, and we apply it just as we do to tigers and chairs, also to people. Okay? So we can categorize things in our environment. We also categorize people. And we categorize people extremely effortlessly. It takes almost no effort to categorize people. We do it spontaneously, right? And we don't just look at a person and say, oh yeah, that's a human. In fact, what we do is we say, this is a particular kind of human, right? This human is distinct. And I just realized I'm missing 2 different slides, which is really unfortunate. Sorry. It's one of those things that you always go through. Okay, I'm missing a few. So I have to just talk without my slides, which is perfectly fine. One of the things that's really, really important to know about categories also is that when a category is activated, so I say the word tiger, one of the things that happens inside your head is that all kinds of associations with tiger suddenly become activated. Okay? So, for example, if I say the word tiger, one of the things that happens is the word lion becomes more accessible. And by accessible, I mean it just comes to mind really fast. Okay? If I say the word tiger, the word cat might come to mind very quickly and very easily. Because we're at the University of Missouri, the word Mizzou might come to mind very quickly because tigers are our school mascot. Okay? So we call this in psychology spreading activation. If I had my slide, I had this very nice graphical depiction of how this all works. And there's been a lot of psychology to show that when you activate a category, all kinds of concepts that are related to that category become pre-activated. So these concepts, they come to mind easier. Okay. So, sorry, I'm really being thrown off here by the fact that, all right. I really apologize about this. Okay. So I don't have these slides, so I still have to talk through it. Oh, I'm really upset because these were really beautiful pictures that I made for you. So again, what does this have to do with people? Well, when we categorize people, one of the things that happens is that all of the associations with that particular person category also become activated. So for example, if I say the word woman, all of your semantic associates, as we call it in psychology, is a fancy word to say, as a way of saying just the concepts that are associated with that category, all of those semantic associates become activated. Some of the things that people typically associate with the word woman is, for example, secretary, or teacher, or mother, or weak, or small, right? So those are sort of like your classic female stereotype words. If you say the word African American, again, a number of stereotypic associates come to mind for many, many, many people. And many of those stereotypic associates are shared by many, many people. So, for example, musical and athletic would be 2 very positive associations with that category. But there are also other more negative associations with that category, like welfare and poor and crime. All right? And the point that I'm trying to make here is that when you activate a human category, when you categorize a person, which is something that you do automatically, all of the concepts that are related to that category are going to become more accessible. They will come to mind more easily. Now, when it comes to people, and here's where I can pick up, there are 3 primary person categories. Every single culture categorizes people in this way, right? And the way that we know this is by asking people and doing a lot of survey research and a lot of experiments, but in every single culture around the world, there are 3 primary ways in which we categorize each other. They are gender, so we categorize each other as being either male or female. Age, so we categorize each other as being either young or old. And also race. We categorize each other on the basis of some kind of racial distinction. Now, the racial distinction can change depending on what kind of society you're in. Brazil famously has different racial categories than we have in the United States. Nonetheless, these categories seem to be primary in almost every single culture. So why these categories? Why are these primary? There are a number of different reasons that have been proposed in the psychological literature, but some of the most obvious ones are that all of these are visual, right? They mostly can't be changed, though we can all think of some very salient examples of cases where people can change these categories. But by and large, these are person categories that are relevant or related to genetics. And also Jim Sidanius, who's a really well-known social psychologist, has proposed that one of the reasons why these are primary categories is because they're related to power dynamics, so they're culturally meaningful. So there's a power dynamic between men and women, young people and old people, and between different races in any given society. Okay, so what I'm trying to do here is just lay a groundwork so that you can kind of understand the basis of a psychological perspective. So this isn't exactly a half-time summary, it's more like a quarter-time summary, but nonetheless, some of the things that we know is that categorization is necessary for survival. It's automatic. And it causes related concepts to become more accessible. Right? So concepts that are related to the category become more accessible. And we use all of these cognitive processes and we apply them to people. We categorize people effortlessly and automatically. And there are three basic person categories that we all use virtually all the time, and they are we categorize people by age, gender, and race. And when we categorize people, this causes the concepts that are associated with those categories to become more accessible. Those concepts are what we call stereotypes. That is what a stereotype is according to a social psychologist. It's the things that you associate with any given social category. That's what a stereotype is. Okay, and I've had this beautiful depiction of what that looks like, and it was gorgeous, but you don't get to see it, and so I apologize. Okay, so now on to some more interesting questions that social psychologists have asked and have been asking for about the past 20 years. First question, how do we know that stereotyping is fast and automatic? Second question, does this implicit bias, so these automatically activated stereotypes, do they have to be endorsed for them to influence our behavior? Or can they influence our behavior even if we don't agree with them and endorse them? Third question, does implicit bias influence our behavior, not just our thoughts? And four, do these findings have any relevance for the real world? Okay, so question number one, how do we know that stereotyping is fast and automatic? We know this through something called priming paradigms. Social psychologists have a gazillion different versions of priming paradigms, but here is essentially what it looks like. Well, I'll show you a very discrete example of a priming paradigm in a minute, but this is essentially how it would go. If I flash a picture of a black face on a computer screen, a face that looks kind of like that, it's a little bit washed out on the screen, but you can get the gist. There are a number of things that happen relative to when I would flash a white face. Participants are faster to recognize and respond to stereotype words. So if I say, is that a word or is it not a word? And it's the word welfare, people are faster to identify that word following a black face than a white face. Okay? That is a highly replicable result. Participants will be faster to recognize and respond to negative words relative to positive words. And here's one of the things that I find to be most amazing of all. So when you show people these pictures when they're in an fMRI scanner, so this is generating a picture of their brain moment by moment, what you see is that brain regions associated with fear light up, so they become activated, at 30 milliseconds following the presentation of a black face. 30 milliseconds is faster than you would be able to behaviorally respond to this thing. It's almost so fast that if I were to show you a stimulus that fast, you would not even know that something had been presented. That's how fast your brain is responding to a black face, versus a white face, which would not activate the same degree of a fear response. Okay? These are generally priming paradigms. And this is how we know that stereotyping happens really fast and really automatically, because we flash these pictures, we ask people to respond, and they respond in these stereotypic ways. I could go on for a while, but I'm going to stop and move on to question 2. Question 2, you might be thinking, okay, so stereotypes can be activated automatically, fine, but don't stereotypes have to be endorsed in order for them to influence my behavior? Because I'm not a biased person. I don't let stereotypes influence me. So isn't it the case that only people who endorse these stereotypes are influenced by them? And so I want to describe to you one study in particular that was highly influential in forming social psychology's perspective on exactly this issue. And this was done way back in 1989 by a woman named Patricia Devine. So here's her thesis. Her thesis is that stereotypes represent cultural knowledge. Okay? They're not individual, they're cultural. We share stereotypes. We have broad shared knowledge of what these stereotypes are. That the stereotypes themselves might be endorsed or they might not be. But because we all share these stereotypes, once they become activated, they can influence our judgments even when they're not endorsed. Okay, that's her thesis. So in study one, she tried to show evidence for the first part of her thesis. And so she asked, are prejudiced and unprejudiced people equally aware of these social stereotypes? To get at this question, she did a really simple survey of undergraduate students and just asked them, what's the stereotype of blacks? So I don't want to know about your personal beliefs. I just want you to report word by word, what are some words that are associated with a cultural stereotype of black people? And then she gave them a big long questionnaire, and embedded within that questionnaire were a bunch of questions about racial bias. So this was a previously validated measure of their racial bias. And here's a very simple result, study one. Prejudice level, as measured by that validated questionnaire, was not at all associated with people's knowledge of the cultural stereotype. So high and low prejudice people alike reported about this approximately the same words. Okay? In study two, she got at the more provocative part of her thesis. Are prejudiced and unprejudiced people equally influenced by these stereotypes that they all know about? And in order to get at this question, she did a study design that's very familiar to social psychologists, but that probably won't be at all familiar to you, so I'm going to walk you through it very slowly. The first thing she had people do was ostensibly an attention vigilance task. So essentially, people are looking at a computer screen and they're seeing a bunch of things flash, words and pictures, and they're supposed to attend to these things and then make a response once all of these flashing lights have stopped. Okay? And they do this for a little while over the course of many trials. What participants were not aware of was that there were words being presented to them. Words that were either associated with the black stereotype, these are words that have been taken from the previous study, or they were neutral words. So here are some examples of the black stereotype words that half of the participants were exposed to in this attention vigilance task. Negroes, lazy, blacks, blues, rhythm, Africa, welfare, basketball. And here's some neutral words. These are a different group of participants who are exposed to these words. Water, then, wood, about, things, people, difference, something, right? So not really stereotypically relevant to any particular stereotype. They're just words. Okay. So that's the first part of the experiment. So she's giving people these stereotypes, unbeknownst to them. She's making them more salient, as we social psychologists would say. Next, the experimenter says, okay, great, you did a really good job, great attention vigilance task. Now we just want you to read this paragraph. We're piloting it for another study, and we just want you to tell us what you think about this paragraph. And it's a paragraph that describes a man's behavior. And their job is to rate the extent to which they think that this man is acting in a hostile and aggressive manner. And the paragraph lists 12 behaviors. And here's the important detail about these behaviors. Each one of them could be interpreted as being hostile and aggressive, or not. So, for example, one of the sentences is, he demands his money back from a store clerk after a purchase. Another is, he refuses to pay his rent until his apartment is repainted. Okay, so you can see how that might be seen as assertive, but it might also be seen as hostile, depending on your frame of mind. And that's exactly the point. So the prediction is that when participants are primed with this black stereotype, they're going to interpret the behavior as being more hostile, even though the word hostile and aggression were not part of the prime. And that's exactly what they found. So it was a reliable difference. Participants here, so this is their hostility rating averaged across all the people in the two different groups. More hostile, higher numbers indicate more hostile ratings, and when they were primed with this black stereotype, they provided more hostile ratings than participants who were not primed with any stereotype at all. Okay? So this study is easy for me to accept because I've seen a lot of them. In fact, this particular effect has been replicated a few times over the course of our history in social psychology, and this wasn't even the first instantiation of this effect. But just to give you the finding in words, so when you prime this black stereotype, it makes people rate ambiguous behaviors as being more hostile. And here's the critical thing that Devine added to the literature, above and beyond other people who'd shown this kind of effect before. She showed that this effect was exactly the same regardless of a person's stated level of prejudice. And so her argument was, we all share this stereotype, and so when it becomes activated, it influences our behavior, regardless of whether or not you endorse it personally. So just to summarize, there's widespread agreement on stereotype content. Priming the stereotype results in more stereotype-consistent judgments, in this case, a hostility rating. This is true for both people who endorse and who don't endorse that stereotype. And so in answer to question 2, do stereotypes have to be endorsed in order for them to influence our judgments? The answer to that question is no, they don't need to be endorsed. They can influence us anyways. Okay, so on to question number 3. You might be thinking, okay, so that was kind of a strange study, but maybe I'll accept that stereotypes can influence our judgments, my judgments even. Even though I'm a well-meaning person, maybe the stereotypes that I know about can influence me. Okay. But this just influences what I think. It doesn't really influence what I do, maybe. So do these processes influence our behavior and our actions? And in order to demonstrate this kind of an effect, I'm going to tell you about 2 different paradigms, one of which is called the weapons identification task, which was developed by Keith Payne in 2001, right down the road at WashU, actually. So here's a theoretical background for his study. Violence and guns are a well-known part of a broad black stereotype. Okay? Take that as an assumption on the basis of lots of survey data. Okay? If black faces are automatically associated with guns, so you show a black face and that's going to make guns more accessible, then seeing a black face should make it easier to identify a gun. Okay. So here's the task. In this task, you're seated in front of a computer screen. Again, we social psychologists like to do a lot on the computer, so forgive me for that. That's just kind of unavoidable. So you see a picture of a face on a computer screen, but you're told ignore that face. Face might look something like that. So it's an example of a white face. Right after you see that face, you're going to see a picture of a gun or a tool. It'll look kind of like that if it's a gun. What we want you to do is identify that object as being either a gun or a tool as fast as you can when you see this. We call that a mask, so it covers up the other images. So when you see that mask, just identify the object that you saw as being either a gun or a tool. And we want you to do this really fast. So the pace of this task is very quick, right? And you're just supposed to press a button. One of them is labeled gun, the other is labeled tool. Okay? Here's how this looks. Okay? Very, very fast. So face, object, mask, hit the response. Face, object, mask, hit the response. This unfolds so quickly that people end up making a lot of errors. And that is what we're interested in. We're interested in their errors and the pattern of errors that they show across different kinds of objects that they're trying to identify. So here are some results. And these are the results from the original paper. This effect has been replicated so many times it's depressing. I have replicated this effect in my lab many times. This effect won't go away. Okay? So here's what I want to direct your attention to. When the target is actually a tool, okay? Higher numbers on this vertical y-axis indicate a greater percent of errors. So people are making quite a few errors, between 30 and 37% errors when they're presented with a tool. And when they make an error on the tool picture, they're pressing the gun key, okay? And what you can see in particular is that people's errors are not random. In fact, they depend on the race of the preceding face. And what ends up happening is that when the preceding face is black, they're making more errors on those tool trials than when the preceding face is white. So what does that mean? That means that when the face is black, they're more likely to press the gun key and make an error by mistakenly thinking that tool's a gun. Okay? You see a slight reversal of that effect for the gun targets in this study. Sometimes that reversal is big, sometimes it's small. Here it's relatively small. But essentially what you can see here is that for the black faces, which of course are represented by the more orangish colored bar, people are making slightly fewer errors. And so what that means is that people are being more accurate to correctly identify a gun when it's preceded by a black face. Okay, so hopefully you all got that. So just to summarize, when you prime people with black faces, it makes them more accurate at identifying guns and more likely to mistake a tool for a gun. So in response to the question, do these processes influence behavior or actions? Well, we've just shown this as a lab demonstration, but it does seem like these processes are influencing our fast and spontaneous actions with regard to identifying objects that are difficult to control. I want to briefly return to question 2. So does any of this depend on whether or not you endorse prejudiced beliefs? Do high and low prejudiced people show the same effects? And the answer is yes, they do. So you can take a room full of people who swear upside down and sideways that they are not prejudiced in any way, and they'll show the same effect. So you might say, well, that study kind of lacks realism. I'm not really seeing how that applies to real life. Hopefully many of you do see the parallels. But you might say, well, that study lacks realism. Can you show me something that's a little bit more realistic, that maybe use some richer stimuli or something like that? And so I'll do that too. This is called the shooter task. It's another very similar paradigm. It was developed by Josh Carell about the same time as the one that I just showed you, 2002. So here's the task. This one's kind of more like a video game. You see a bunch of pictures. And what you have to do when you see the pictures, decide as fast as you can whether or not the person in the picture is holding a gun or is holding some other innocuous object like a can of soda or a wallet or some keys. Okay, so are they holding a gun or something else? You want to shoot the person if they have a gun, using, like a joystick. But don't shoot them if they don't have a gun. So we only want you to shoot dangerous people who are holding guns. Right? So you can imagine how this is kind of like a video game. And here are some example pictures. So again, as you might imagine, that really is not showing up very well, but some of the people in the picture are black, some of the people in the pictures are white, and they're all either holding guns or tools. And there are a lot of different backgrounds, so the people are in different positions, trying to make this a little bit more realistic. And here's what you find. Again, higher numbers on this, so higher bars indicate that people are making more errors. And what you see is that when the target in the picture is unarmed, people are making more errors when the target's black than white. Okay, so they're accidentally shooting the picture of the black guy who's unarmed more often than they're shooting the picture of the white guy who's unarmed. And you get a nice reversal of this effect when he's actually armed, so they're more accurate to shoot the black guy who's armed than the white guy who's armed. Okay? All right. I like to call these black gun association paradigms because there are a lot of them and they all show the same thing. And what they all show is that people are better at identifying objects as guns when they're either preceded by or held by or in some approximation to black people. So when a black person appears, people are better at identifying guns. This is also shown with degraded images of guns. People are better at saying that the image is a gun, in any case. So pulling this all together, starting from the beginning and getting to where we are now, we automatically categorize the faces as being black. That's kind of unavoidable. There's an automatic activation of a black stereotype, which includes concepts like violence and guns. As a result, the concept gun becomes more accessible. It comes to mind easier, and that makes it easier for us to identify guns when they appear, and it makes us make more errors when guns aren't there. Okay. So because of my missing slides, I'm getting through this a little bit faster than I anticipated, but I'm glad because that'll leave us with some additional room for questions at the end. So question 4. You may be wondering, how does any of this apply to real life? Social psychologists spend a lot of time in the lab developing computer tasks that are meant to create specific circumstances that elicit bias. But do any of these things apply to real life? Do we have any evidence at all? Right? And so I'm going to tell you about a very provocative study that was done by Jennifer Eberhardt in 2006. And in fact, this study was part of the reason why she recently won the MacArthur Genius Award. Her question was, does the stereotypicality of black faces influence sentencing decisions? Okay. And here is her method. She took a database from Philadelphia, which included cases that were death penalty eligible from 1979 to 1999. And she took cases where all the defendants were black and where the victim was either white or black. Okay, so it was about equally divided between black defendants and white victims, and black defendants and black victims. Okay, so she looked at these separately because it turned out to be important. All of these defendants for whom she had data and information were death penalty eligible. And she took from this file just the picture of the person. And she standardized it, so the only thing that was visible was the face from, the neck up. And then she took 51 undergraduate students into her lab, and she said, I just want you to rate the stereotypicality of these faces. Okay. So using features, whatever features you want, like lips, nose, hair texture, skin tone, whatever, and I want you for each face to tell me on a scale from 1 to 11 whether or not this person is not at all stereotypically black or looks extremely stereotypically black. So for each face, just make this rating, however you want to rate it. And the undergraduates didn't know anything about where these pictures were coming from. They were just rating these faces. Here's an example of what their rating system turned up. So one of these faces is very stereotypically black, and the other one is not very stereotypically black, according to the scale, the ratings of the undergraduates. And you can probably guess which one is which, right? The one on your right is the more stereotypically black face. The one on the left is the less stereotypically black face, according to these undergraduate raters. Why use the undergraduate raters? Because this creates a standardization, some form of agreement of how stereotypic or not a face is. And what was her prediction? That the more stereotypic faces would be more likely to get the death penalty than the less stereotypic faces. So very provocative prediction. And you might be thinking, well, there are all sorts of other circumstances for each one of these trials. How do they deal with that? Well, it turned out that this database was extremely rich, and so she was able to statistically control for all kinds of features of the case. So aggravating circumstances like the victim status as a police officer, prior convictions, the crime characteristics like the presence or absence of torture or kidnapping. There were also a variety of mitigating circumstances that were listed for each case, like the defendant's age, emotional disturbance, lack of prior convictions, and whether they were coerced in their role in the crime. All this stuff, this is actually kind of a short list of the things that she controlled for. So then the question becomes, all of these things being equal, does the stereotypicality of the face make a difference in the likelihood of getting the death penalty? And here's the data. So the top bars are black defendants and white victims. Okay? The bottom two bars are black defendants and black victims. And the different kinds of bars are the less stereotypic faces, kind of all lumped together, and the more stereotypic faces, all lumped, averaged together. So when it came to the black victims, the stereotypicality of the face, it turned out that didn't matter. So a little over 40% of them got the death penalty, regardless of the stereotypicality of the face. But now I'm sure your eyes have already wandered up top to the big difference in the bars on the top part of the figure. And here you show that the less stereotypically black faces get the death penalty about 20% of the time, and the more stereotypically black faces are getting the death penalty about 60% of the time. Okay. I had some circles to highlight this, but now it's irrelevant. This is a very provocative association. And so I do want to point out that it doesn't prove causality. So If you look at data a lot like I do, you always want to keep in mind that if you have a correlation, it doesn't mean that you know that one thing caused another. Okay? But it's provocative data precisely because they controlled for so many case characteristics. And so it's difficult to come up with other reasons why there would be such a huge disparity in who's getting the death penalty and who's not. So here's a social psychological interpretation on the basis of all the theory that I've sort of been alluding to up until now and describing directly, actually. Stereotypically black faces are more likely to evoke a strong stereotypic association. They're more prototypical. They're more central to like our memory for the category. Since we're going to have stronger stereotypic associations, this is going to make the defendant seem more hostile, aggressive, and violent. Just seem that way, holding constant what they actually are. So we're going to make more assumptions about them. If there's any ambiguity in any of their behaviors, we're going to be more likely to interpret that ambiguity as being hostile and aggressive and violent rather than not. And it's going to make them seem more deserving of the death penalty because it's going to make them seem like more of a bad person. You might be wondering, well, why then was it only observed for black on white crime? And the explanation, this is the author's explanation from the paper. There are a variety of ways to explain this, and it's definitely not a closed book like any scientific experiment or observation. Her explanation was that when you have black on white crime, race is more relevant and it's more noticed. So for black on black crime, the the event may be seen as stemming more from interpersonal conflict. These are actually her words from the paper. Whereas black on white crime may be perceived as stemming from intergroup conflict, making race more salient and making people more likely to draw on these stereotypic associations when they are evaluating a person. Okay, so question 4 answered, does any of this apply to real life? I'm going to say that it appears that the answer is yes. Although, like I said, we're looking at associations, not experiments that can show causality. So, closing summary. Categorization is automatic. There's no denying that. And it is necessary for survival. We can't undo this aspect of our cognitive architecture, and we should not because we need it. Unfortunately, we also categorize each other automatically and effortlessly. It's an unfortunate byproduct of this cognitive architecture that we have. When we see a person, the stereotypes associated with their category become automatically activated. And these don't need to be endorsed in order to become activated. You just need to know the stereotype. And this implicit bias, as we like to call it, influences a lot of our judgments and behavior, observed mostly inside the lab, but there's some suggestion that it influences us outside of the lab as well. Okay, so you may be wondering at this point, well, is anyone immune to these processes? And the answer is no. We all have this cognitive architecture. We all categorize each other. We all have associations with these person categories. We're all in the same boat. And if you have any takeaway message, I would like that to be really one of the fundamental ones. But it is important to realize that the exact composition of your personal associations or the stereotypes that you know can differ between people. We don't all have exactly the same stereotypic associations. And the degree to which we believe these stereotypes may also differ between people. And that's important because endorsing stereotypes versus not is a really important thing that I haven't even touched on in this talk. Will this implicit bias influence us all the time? No. Doesn't influence us all the time. That would be a vast oversimplification of the situation. So what kinds of behaviors and judgments are influenced by implicit bias, as I've described it? The behaviors that are influenced include split-second decisions, eye contact and body language, because we don't tend to monitor those things as much, physical distance between us and other people, because we don't tend to monitor that as much either. So anything that we can't control or that we don't really try to control because we don't think to, those are the sorts of judgments and behavior that are likely to be influenced by your stereotypic associations and mine. What behaviors are less likely to be influenced by implicit bias? The judgments and decisions that allow time for correction, if you believe that correction is important. Then you're going to be less influenced by implicit bias. And this includes, very importantly, the things that we say out loud. We are constant monitors of the things that we say out loud, and so the things that we say tend not to be influenced by implicit bias so much as the things that we do. So anything that we have the motivation and opportunity to control is likely to not be influenced by implicit bias. So now you might be thinking, well, I don't want to be biased, so what can I do? You've painted a really bleak picture, and I realized as I was walking over here today that I really was painting a bleak picture, and it doesn't have to be so bleak because it is possible to learn new associations with social groups. So when we're exposed to counter-stereotypic people, this is just a fancy way of saying people who defy our stereotypic expectations, then this can actually reduce implicit gender and racial bias. Proven in the lab, it's been shown. Some of my research has actually looked at exactly this issue. And when we have positive personal experiences with others, this can override our knowledge of social stereotypes. So you have a really, really positive interaction with a person who doesn't meet expectations for this cultural stereotype, that's going to help to change your implicit bias. And then I would also encourage you all to keep trying to not be biased. And why is this important? It's actually important empirically, as shown in the lab. When you have a chronic goal to be unbiased, this will guide your attention to things and events that contradict the stereotypes that have been conveyed to you culturally. And so these chronic goals can, over time, help to reduce the amount of implicit bias that you have. And then finally, what I always encourage people to do is make an effort to see people as individuals, which is really hard when you're just walking down the street or ordering food at a restaurant or, seeing people in class. It's hard to make an effort to see every single person you encounter as an individual. But we are all individuals. We're not just characterized by our group membership, and the extent to which you can see a person as an individual, that will dictate the degree to which you are influenced by these implicit biases when you interact with them. So learn about people, learn their personal story, learn their characteristics, the things that set them apart and make them different, and then you will at least solve the problem of implicit bias with that person. And so with that, I'd like to take some questions.
Remember to go to the microphone if you would. There's a microphone right here.
Hi. Is it working?
Yeah, I think
okay.
so.
Could you talk about the racial composition of the people who were participating in these studies?
That's a great question.
Or even the age differences, if there was any differences noted there?
Yeah, that's a fabulous question. So for the most part, a lot of this research has been done with white undergraduate students. Right, so we know a little bit about how people of different racial backgrounds evaluate all kinds of different racial groups, but most of this research has been done on white people, and for the most part, the target is usually black versus white targets, and that is simply because of the culture that we live in and the sorts of issues that people feel is important to research. Although I should note, in my own research, when I've done the weapons identification task, we have sometimes some diverse samples. And one of the things that I found is that overall, it doesn't really matter whether or not you look at just the white students or the white and the Asian and the black students all together. Everybody's showing, on average at least, some of this weapons bias.
Okay, so so just to be clear, you were saying that no matter what race a person was, at least as far as the weapons biases go, like they were pretty consistent?
So, all right, so I can't be completely clear on that question. And the reason why is that there's just not a ton of data because the vast majority of the subjects in these experiments have been white. I can tell you in my own personal experience, it doesn't matter whether or not you include a larger sample that includes all it's usually students, right, who are taking these experiments, or just the white students. But that doesn't mean that it always doesn't matter, right? So, and there are experiments that have shown that, you know, the stereotypes that are activated automatically can change depending on your racial perspective, you know, your identity, and by the context. So here's another, all of the things that I told you today have all kinds of nuances that I wasn't able to cover because it's a short talk. But one of the things that we do know is that, for example, if you enter a room filled with white men, then the primary way that you're going to categorize them is by age, because that's what distinguishes these people, right? And that shows up in these kinds of tasks as well. So if you only show people pictures of, you know, black faces, then the bias isn't as evident as when you show them pictures of white and black faces pitted against each other. So the context of the stimuli matters. The person's perspective matters because of the stereotypes that they've been exposed to and the ones that they, and how they, you know, have interacted with people, the counter-stereotypic exemplars that they know, to use a fancy word for, you know, people who defy stereotypes. So, more?
My original question before you spit, you were saying before that a way to combat this would be to develop new associations.
Yes.
And also you were speaking about how it happens in like 30 milliseconds, like the association with the stereotypes. So I was wondering, this might be cool in like a setting like this to kind of say like this might be what, like 75 of us in here, but like, so for the split second situations, are you trying to say that the developing new associations would kind of combat like the errors or whatever, like people mistaking someone from having a gun or something like that? Like, is that what you were trying to say? Like, if we build the different associations, then in those split second decisions, then we'll have different reactions?
Yes. So let me tell you about two different studies that have addressed this. Okay. So one study showed participants a whole bunch of really positive black role models, or a bunch of really negative black role models. So there were two different conditions, one black positive, one black negative, and then they had them engage one of these tasks. And what they showed is that bias was temporarily reduced after people had been repeatedly exposed to really positive black exemplars, so black individuals. So bias was, and so that's when I say that bias can be reduced by exposing yourself to counter-stereotypic people, then that's what I'm referring to. Let's see, what was the other study that I was going to talk to you about? I can't remember the other one, but does that one address your question? Sort of? No, not really? Not yet?
Yeah, I was just curious. As you were speaking, I was thinking about ways where like we could put that into practice. Like if you're saying like it's not all prejudice that's kind of pushing that way, then like what were ways to kind of like reverse that, or to change the way we view people, or like our stereotypes? Like I didn't even know if that was possible. I kind of figured they were really cemented, like in
the
society,
stereotypes are cemented.
You know, like, so I didn't think
they are really hard to work on. Stereotypes are really hard to work on, and that is because no matter what you do in the lab to influence people's stereotypes, they then go out into the world, and then they get those stereotypes reinforced again. So then they come back, and anything that you did to intervene has been completely washed out. Yeah, so there are a lot of nuances here, though. I mean, there are people who don't show this bias, right? There's always variability for every task. Whenever you see a mean, you have to assume that there's a lot of variability around that mean. So, you know, the key is why don't some people show bias and others do? And what we do know, though, is that it is very, very, very hard to change bias on these weapons tasks in particular, and other implicit tasks as well. Really hard to change people's responses.
Just really, really quickly. You
Sure.
have to answer.
Yeah.
But I was just wondering if you can tell me where I could locate some information about the intersectionality of it all, since I only saw males up there, and I want to know, like, what are the implications of when you actually insert gender?
Yeah, so, well, the original weapons identification task had pictures of both men and women that were used as the face stimuli, and it didn't make a difference. Okay. So people didn't discriminate between men versus women. It was just black versus white was the primary category that seemed that people were using in that task. But other paradigms have shown that when you give people a little bit more information about the face, those faces were like this much information, right? When you give people more information, people tend to have a little bit less bias towards, for example, if you're looking in a black-white context, a little bit less bias towards black women relative to black men, still more bias towards both of those groups than either white women or white men.
Could you clarify for me, because it doesn't seem to me that the Eberhardt study with sentencing is an example of implicit bias, just because you have a lot of
great
time
question.
built
Great.
in there. And maybe you could speculate as to why or what type of bias that would be.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, this is always the issue when you see these effects emerge out of real life data. Is it the case that you have people who are explicitly biased and who endorse this bias, or is it this, more subversive effect of implicit bias that's happening? There's a part of me. I mean, and honestly, there's no aspect of the data that would be able to say one way or another what is causing the issue with death sentencing. We just don't know. The data don't speak to that issue. So I could hand wave all day long and talk to you about it, but I wouldn't be saying anything that was supported by any data. The one thing that I do know is that we just have so much evidence now that people are influenced in this implicit way when they perceive people. They're not aware of the fact that they're being so influenced by the way a person looks and by the way that, and by the color of their skin, that it's plausible, and in fact I think even likely, that this could be happening for people who don't explicitly endorse racial prejudice and who don't see themselves as being racist either. And that makes this entire discussion that we nationally have about race that much harder to have if bias can be happening among people who don't explicitly endorse racial prejudice. Yeah.
And just maybe a word in follow-up to that, what I've been thinking about is, since one of the phrases that to me was powerful in your talk was that these stereotypes are cultural knowledge that we have. And so I guess for me, the next set of questions probably goes far beyond social psychology into I don't know what field we need to talk to next. But I appreciated what you said about trying on the individual level to counteract some of these effects. But really, it seems to me that we have to begin figuring out, all of us have to begin figuring out how to interrupt that cultural knowledge or what we claim to be knowledge, because if it's automatic the way you're describing and all that, it seems like that's really where the...
Right, and there are just so many ways in which people pick up on this cultural knowledge. Like, for example, I'm going to use a personal example because this was just utterly profound to me. My daughter watched Dumbo, and in Dumbo there's a very scary scene where there's a lot of thunder and lightning and all the circus guys are setting up the tents, and all the circus guys are black. Right? So then we go and we read a book. This is months later, and I know that she got really scared when she saw this, and she's hiding her head in the pillow. Months later, we're reading a book. It's also kind of circus related, and there's a person in the picture who's just obscured by a shadow, so they're darker. And she immediately, this is a 3-year-old, points to the picture and says, "That's a bad guy, Mommy." And I'm thinking to myself, how did you do that? How did you make that connection so fast? I need to undo that immediately. Immediately. And how am I going to protect you from this? You have to learn about history. You have to learn about all of these, all of the history of the United States, which includes a lot of, racial bias and systemic prejudice and slavery. But how do I teach you about that without teaching you also about all these associations that are then going to influence you implicitly? That's a really hard question. Right.
Well, we are just about out of time. There's probably a class about ready to come in here, so let's thank Dr. Scherer for her presentation.
Thank you.